Welcome to the last lecture in the Spring Faculty Lecture Series, The Worlds of William Shakespeare. At the end of our lecture, I will remind you of the symposium which takes place next week in another hall. Our subject tonight is Shakespearean tragedy, theater, or meta-theater. Our speaker on the faculty of the Department of Theater Arts here at UCLA. He attended the universities of Louvain in Belgium, the Sorbonne, and Oxford. His principal concentration as a student was history in preparation for an academic career, which he abandoned for the dramatic arts. He was dramatic and film critic in London before taking up screenwriting and broadcasting. He wrote screenplays in the British film studios and was likewise part of the British documentary movement. After World War II, he worked as a writer in the various major Hollywood studios and also in Rome and Germany. To his credit are such screenplays as Helen of Troy and Ulysses. At UCLA, his courses include history and aesthetic of motion pictures, writing for the screen, and also he is coordinator of the integrated course in the arts. It is with great pleasure I present to you Professor Hugh Gray. Professor Gray.
Thank you very much, Dr. Frankel. Well, ladies and gentlemen, we're on slippery ground tonight. At least I am, and I assure you I'm aware of the fact. And it's a situation which, if I may put it so, gives one a very dubious foothold for the job of weighing imponderables. Such a thought, I have no doubt, immediately conjures up in your imaginations a new variant of Sisyphean task, the one which lets you get the imponderables onto the traditionally hand-held scales of judgment just as your feet slip from under you. Such frustration. But what are these imponderables? First of all, there's the theatre itself, that mystery of mysteries. Then comes tragedy. Ask a child, a young man or woman, a person in love, a stockbroker, a priest, a scholar, a philosopher, a man under immediate sentence of death. I suppose we're all under ultimate sentence of death, and you're likely to get a variety of answers. Third on our list comes Shakespeare. Others abide our question, thou art free. We ask and ask, thou smilest and art still, out-topping knowledge. For the loftiest hill that to the stars uncrowns his majesty, planting his steadfast footsteps in the sea, making the heaven of heavens his dwelling place, spares but the cloudy border of his base to the foiled searching of mortality. And thou, who didst the stars and sunbeams know, self-schooled, self-scanned, self-honored, self-secure, didst walk on earth unguessed at, better so. All pains the immortal spirit must endure, all weakness that impairs, all griefs that bow, find their sole voice in that victorious brow. Then, of course, there is that strange new word, meta-theatre, but I shall come to that in due course. Let us begin with tragedy. It is reasonable to suppose that there was tragedy in life before there was tragedy upon the stage, unless, of course, it's another case like the Sunsets after Mr. Turner of life mirroring art. A moment's reflection shows us that the word tragedy is theatre-derived. It comes, as we know, from the Greek tragodia, or goat song, and according to Liddell and Scott, if they are still a reliable authority, first appeared in the Acharnians of Aristophanes, line 400. We should not have remained long in Thrace if the country had not been covered in snow. The rivers were icebound at the time that Theognis brought out his tragedy here. Tragic incident mars World Series, the journalists would write, if a stand collapsed. Tragic? Goat-like? What would be goat-like about the incident? Absurd, says the uninitiate. Even more absurd than you think, the initiate replies. Aye, there's the rub, and hence the justification for our too brief summary. There is no reason here except such as we might put, looking for some order, rooted in disorder, like our dramatist himself, or as Richard Sewell has put it in his excellent study, The Vision of Tragedy, speaking of one aspect of it as undeniably true, namely that the highest comedy gains its power from its sense of tragic possibility, and the profoundest tragedy presents a fully fleeting vision through the temporary disorder of an ordered universe, to which comedy is witness. Set forth, if I may add to Sewell's thought, like the labyrinthine brain itself in pattern convolutions that life has made together with words, woven anew by each of the poets, their lawful guardians and protectors, parce the logicians, positives and others, and prince among whom is Shakespeare himself. But let us stay first with life a while, for surely its roots are in life. How did men express this experience, this sense, before Aeschylus and his fellow poets, transforming the Dionysia, presented its clear form and outline to the people of Athens? How, for example, did those people name it who count in their literature the book of Job and the traditions of the Egyptian captivity and the history of the Babylonian exile? By the waters of Babylon we sat down and wept when we remembered thee, O Zion. As for our harps, we hanged them upon the trees that are therein, for they that led us away captive required of us then a song and melody in our heaviness. Sing us one of the songs of Sion. How shall we sing the Lord's song in a strange land? If I forget thee, O Jerusalem, let my right hand forget her cunning, let my tongue cleave to the roof of my mouth. I was told when I inquired that the nearest expression for what we mean by the notion of tragedy was in ancient Hebrew a scene of weeping, I reckon as this was. In Arabic, if I may be pardoned the sensitive juxtaposition, into which language the works of Aristotle were translated, had no word of it for tragedy of its own for tragedy till recently or comparatively recently, or so again I was told. A sense of fate, of destiny presumably, as there seemingly was in the early Nordic tales, but not in the sense that we have tragedy. And perhaps indeed only a mind conditioned by the Greek tradition would ask such questions as I do now. Jew and Mohammedan have other visions, other values. Today, what does it mean to Western man? The best known treatise on this subject is of course that of Miguel de Unamuno, his tragic sense of life. Let me introduce you to him through the eyes of Sewell. In general, the tragic vision is not a systematic view of life. It admits wide variations and degrees. It is a sum of insights, intuitions, feelings, to which the word view or vision or sense of life, however inadequate, are most readily applicable. The tragic sense of life, as Unamuno described it, is a sub-philosophy or a pre-philosophy, more or less formulated, more or less conscious. It reaches deep down into the temperament, not so much flowing from ideas as determining them. It is an attitude towards life with which some individuals seem to be endowed to a high degree, others less, but which is latent in every man and may be evoked by experience. Unamuno finds it characteristic of some nations and not of others. Horace Walpole's epigram, "This world is a comedy to those who think, a tragedy to those who feel," has only relative truth, but it is significant in showing how readily the terms become metaphors to describe a view of life, a cast of thought or temperament. The tragic vision in its first phase is primal, in that it calls up out of the depths the first and last of all questions, the question of existence. What does it mean to be? It recalls the original terror, harking back to a world that antedates the conception of philosophy, the consolations of the later religions, and whatever construction the human mind has devised to persuade itself that its universe is secure. It recalls the original unreason, the terror of the unrational. I have put the commentary before the text of Unamuno because I think that when one is listening, as distinct from reading, it is helpful to know what to look for rather than be left trying to figure out something while the speaker is already on his way to another point. Here now is Unamuno. Let us remain keenly suspecting that the longing not to die, the hunger for personal immortality, the effort whereby we tend to persist indefinitely in our own being, which according to the tragic Jew, by whom of course he means Spinoza, with his view that the essential principle of man's make-up was the struggle to continue to be the conatus, as he calls it, the effort, which then, according to the tragic Jew, is our very essence, that this is the affective base of all knowledge and the personal inward starting point of all human philosophy, underlying even the so-called problem of knowledge. There is simply, underlying even the so-called problem of knowledge, there is simply this human feeling. All the rest is either to deceive oneself or to wish to deceive others, and to wish to deceive others in order to deceive oneself. And this personal and affective starting point of all philosophy and all religion is the tragic sense of life. The visible universe, he continues, that is created by the instinct of self-preservation becomes all too narrow for me. More, and always more is his cry. I want to be myself, and yet without ceasing to be myself, to be others as well, to merge myself into the totality of things visible and invisible. Not to be all and forever is as if not to be, either all or nothing. All or nothing. And what other meaning can the Shakespearean to be or not to be have? Or that passage in Coriolanus where it is said of Marcius, he wants nothing of a god but eternity. Eternity, eternity. That is the supreme desire. For the poets of all ages and from the depths of their souls, this tremendous vision of the flowing away of life like water has wrung bitter cries. From Pindar's dream of a shadow, Scias honor, to Calderon's life is a dream, and Shakespeare's we are such stuff as dreams are made on, this last a yet more tragic sentence than Calderon's. For whereas the Castilian only declares that our life is a dream, but not that we ourselves are the dreamers of it, the Englishman makes us ourselves a dream that dreams. Unamuno, incidentally, does not add those lines from Pindar, it's from the 8th Pythian Ode, that so parallel man and the role of the actor. Epameri, things of a day, fleeting things. What is he? Who is he, this dream of a shadow? And yet, he says, when some God-given glory falls, then all is sweet. It's life, and it's the life of an actor. Who is he behind that mask? And yet, when some little praise for some good part comes, life is sweet. If there were time, we might follow the road signs that seem to point here to Kierkegaard and Tillich, and we might inquire of the Sartreans, their views, and why so many of them have expounded their philosophy in dramatic form. But we must press on to tragedy in the theatre, for it is of the plays that the question, which is our title, has been asked, of the tragedies. The last quotation of Unamuno brings us near to the argument of Lionel Abel, the only begetter of the word meta-theatre. For it is precisely to the two phrases, all the world's a stage from Shakespeare, and Calderon's life's a dream, and to their connotations, that he turns to support in part his argument that the tragedies of Shakespeare, with the exception of Macbeth, are not in the true sense tragedies. Rather are they what he calls, searching for a new word, tentatively, and admitting that there might be a better, has called meta-theatre. Now, to some of you, all this may already be old hat, and I apologize if it is so, but perhaps it is not the case for all. Meta-theatre, then, is the title of a paperback by Lionel Abel, published last year by Hill and Wang in the category A Drama Book. Its subtitle is A New View of Dramatic Form. Mr. Abel is a playwright and critic whose play Absalom may be familiar to you. It won 2 awards as the best off-Broadway play of 1956 and was praised by Camus. 2 other plays of his, The Death of Odysseus and The Pretender, have likewise been well spoken of. He is also a critic who has long contributed to Partisan Review, Kenyon Review, Commentary, The New Republic, and The Nation. And last but not least, who is contributing to our evening here. Most of Shakespeare's tragedies, he says, are defective. They are failures as tragedies, not failures as tragedy, not effort to write melodrama. Lear, Coriolanus, Julius Caesar, Timon of Athens are inadequate tragedies, if we take that form seriously. But on the other hand, we can assume that Shakespeare did not want these plays to be melodramatic, just as we can assume he did not want them to be imperfect. This judgment seems to appeal to some objective standard. It speaks of a form to be taken seriously. What form? It would seem from what we have tried to discover, however briefly, about tragedy in life, that there is a variety of possibilities. Is this so of tragedy in the theatre? And in what does it differ from tragedy in life? The question is the same as if we asked, in what do art and life differ? And our answer brings us back to Aristotle's most basic statement, to the one word mimesis. Mimesis meaning imitation properly understood. Not mimicry, not mime, but imitation, as I say, properly understood. Namely, man creating in the way that man can create, paralleling nature, imitating nature in that nature creates, going along with nature in that sense, giving a form so that that which he wishes to show forth may be most splendidly and truly manifest. Thus it was that Aeschylus, taking occasion by the feasts of Dionysos, built upon what was there and studied the relations of the gods and men, and what might henceforth be in an Athens, finally liberated from the Persians. And the way he and his successors carried this out, being analyzed by Aristotle, was seen to follow a pattern varying somewhat according to him, though not according to, I beg your pardon, no. Aristotle was seen to follow a pattern varying somewhat, and according to him, though not to everybody, being exemplified in Sophocles, and among Sophocles' work, best in the Oedipus Tyrannus, Oedipus the king. In his Poetics, Aristotle thus describes the perfect tragedy. A perfect tragedy should be arranged not on the simple but the complex plan. Sounds like insurance almost, doesn't it? A simple plan being one in which the change of fortune of the hero takes place without reversal of the situation. That is to say, the tables being turned and things which looked good becoming bad and so forth, and without recognition. That is to say, recognizing somebody and somebody who is, in relation to the ship of the two characters, a sort of catalyst or to the tragedy. The complex being accompanied by such reversal or recognition, or by both. In other words, all these things are part of it, you see. It should, moreover, imitate actions which excite fear and pity, this being the distinctive mark of tragic imitation. We all know that. We all talk about these things. These words are constantly on our tongues, and we are not always quite sure, perhaps, whether we understand them or not. They are repeated, but it's quite clear that when repeated in the 20th century, difficult for them to have the same kind of connotation as in the 5th century before Christ. It follows plainly in the first place that the change of fortune presented must not be the spectacle of a virtuous man brought from prosperity to adversity, for this moves neither pity nor fear. It merely shocks us. We don't like to see that. A really outstanding man. This is painful. Nor again is it that of a bad man passing from adversity to prosperity, which we think we see around us all the time. For nothing can be more alien to the spirit of tragedy. It possesses no single tragic quality. It neither satisfies the moral sense, nor calls forth pity or fear. Nor again should the downfall of the utter villain be exhibited. A plot of this kind would doubtless satisfy the moral sense, but it would inspire neither pity nor fear, for pity is aroused by unmerited misfortune, fear by the misfortune of man like ourselves. Such an event, therefore, will be neither pitiful nor terrible. He sounds a little priggish, but I don't think he really meaning to be. he talks about the moral sense, but one must understand what Aristotle means here by the moral sense. He doesn't mean, don't do that, said the angry teacher. He doesn't mean that. It isn't, why? Because I say so. That's not morality. That's just sort of bullying. What he really means by morality is the perfect ordaining of actions towards their end. It's a somewhat more exalted thing. In other words, it's the reason why, or the reason within the thing why something should be attained, you see. So it isn't that he isn't as priggish as he sounds. In fact, it's really rather exalted, if one had time to go into it. There remains then the character between these two extremes, that of a man who is not eminently good and just, yet whose misfortune is brought about by some error or frailty. There we go. That's the thing we all know about, when we learnt it at school, the tragic flaw. We're at home. We've got something to grasp onto. He must be one who is highly prosperous, because, after all, one must respect that kind of a person. A personage, say, like Oedipus or Thyestes, or other illustrious men of such families, the old families of the mythical peoples of early Greece. The practice of the stage bears out our view. Notice that expression about Aristotle, you know. We're always sort of talking about him being rather a rather dictatorial philosopher and all that sort of thing, and laying down laws. People have said that, for instance, this eternal sort of argument about induction and deduction, that there's no induction in Aristotle, which of course is patent nonsense. The idea that induction was something discovered by Bacon, that cold morning he went out and started stuffing a turkey with snow in order to find out whether, induction. But there is induction, and here's in Aristotle, and here is a notice of it, you see. The practice of the stage bears out our view. He's quite humble about that. The best tragedies are founded on the fortunes of Oedipus and Orestes and those others who have done or suffered something terrible. And so Euripides is not in error, because his plays for the most part end unhappily. Everybody was picking on poor old Euripides. Aristophanes and everybody. Euripides was the kind of rebel. He was, of course, pretty well a declared atheist in some ways. At any rate, he of course was supremely made fun of in one of Aristophanes' plays. Well, here Aristotle comes to his defense. Euripides is not in error, because his plays for the most part end unhappily. It is the right ending, you see. Tragedy must end unhappily, you see. And this, of course, is what we look at, for example, in all plays. In Shakespeare particularly. That's why we're going through this agonizing reappraisal of Mr. Aristotle. Such, in brief, was, so to speak, the pure doctrine of orthodoxy, for the pedants at least. Another influence was in the field before Aristotle. As Shakespeare made that is to say in the Elizabethan times, as Shakespeare made Polonius say, and as Hyatt points out, the chief classical stimuli acting upon Renaissance drama were not the Greeks, but the Romans, Seneca and Plautus. There's a sort of general feeling for those who've had a sort of quick course in this kind of thing, that suddenly there was Renaissance whipped out Aristotle's Poetics, and all the dramatists sat round and studied it and then wrote their plays. That, of course, is not, as you see, the case at all. For the English playwrights, Seneca was the master of tragedy and a deep influence on Shakespeare, for whom the formula of Aristotle was too rigid. Shakespeare, who revealed new meanings in the idea of the tragic failing. In Hamlet, Othello, Lear, Macbeth, Coriolanus, we have just those plays, of course, that our friend Mr. Abel has picked on. We have the ruin of noble natures through some defect of character, says Butcher in his commentary on the Poetics. In infinitely various ways it has been shown that the most dramatic of motives is the process by which a frailty or flaw of nature grows and expands till it culminates in tragic disaster. Well then, such, we may say, is the general and somewhat open-minded consensus of most. Before going on to Mr. Abel, however, let me, by way of contrast and by way of introducing a somewhat strident critical voice in dissent concerning the views of Aristotle, to wit those of A.J. Taylor. Let me introduce him. he concludes a little monograph, which some of you may have read, on Aristotle in a refreshingly aggressive way. The philosopher, speaking of the philosopher, he says in the very last paragraphs, Aristotle's account of tragedy as art criticism has probably been vastly overrated. From first to last, the standpoint he assumes in his verdicts on the great tragic poets is that of the gallery. Very severe, isn't it? But he's a severe man. He's attacked everybody, I think. However, he's echoing what an English 18th century writer of comedies said when people were beginning to get tired of the insistence of the rules on drama. Farquhar said, when you want to find theatre, drama, tragedy, you must look for it in the stalls and in the pit, not among the disciples of Aristotle. So Mr. Farquhar was really praising Aristotle. If Mr. Farquhar had only had a chance to meet Mr. Taylor, they would have discovered that Aristotle was going by the pit and the gallery, and so that everything would have been quite all right. It would, so to speak, if I may say so, have come full circle. From first to last, then, the standpoint he assumes is that of the gallery. What he insists on all through, probably because he had the purgative effect of the play always in mind, is well-woven plot with plenty of melodramatic surprise in the incidents and a thoroughly sensational culmination in a scene of unrelieved catastrophe over which the spectator can have a good cry and so get well purged of his superfluous emotion. This is, of course, our famous friend catharsis, which some look upon as a purge and others as a more spiritual thing. You see, what one must remember, I suppose, in looking at the views of Aristotle about these things, about tragedy and about everything, was that he was a biologist, and biologists are scientific, and they're apt perhaps to look at purge in a somewhat scientific way. It is clear from his repeated allusions that the play he admired above all things was King Oedipus of Sophocles. But it is equally clear, and this sounds astonishing on the part of Mr. Taylor, that he admired it not for the profound insight into human life and destiny, or the deep sense of the mystery of things which some modern critics have found in it, but because its plot is the best and most startling detective story ever devised, and its finale a triumph of melodramatic horror. This, of course, may help us to understand Aristotle's failure to understand certain things about, for example, the true nature of tragedy, as Mr. Abel would indicate. Well, Mr. Abel's feelings about the ineffective dramas or tragedies of Shakespeare are to be found in an examination that he makes of Sophocles. Sophocles has been a source of great inspiration to him. And not merely the Tyrannus, but also the Colonnas. I hope I'm not sort of taking too much for granted. The classics perhaps are not studied as now as they were once upon a time, so that everybody doesn't have these plays perhaps at their fingertips. Not that they had them at their fingertips exactly then. But you remember that there are two plays of Sophocles in this area. There is the play in which Oedipus, who has been exposed as a child, brought up in a family, sets out upon his life, murders a man or kills a man in a chariot, solves a riddle, comes to a city, marries the queen. The city is suddenly put under a heavenly edict, a terrible plague there, and of course all the time, as we know, what has happened, I mean, after all, Freud has helped us to know about this, that the trouble was that Oedipus murdered his father and married his mother. Well, now, for those of you who didn't go any farther than that, who didn't go into sort of second group of the course, Oedipus at Colonus is at the end of his life. He is now, having blinded himself and so on, he has actually purged himself of his guilt, as it were, and he has now come to Athens to die. Everybody really wanted to have the old man dying around them because there was some kind of glory about him. This is, as a matter of fact, one of Mr. Abel's point. He was a sort of daimon, a kind of Superman, and he comes there, and this is the story of his arrival there and of prior to his actually disappearing into the beyond, where his son comes to him, the sons who are quarreling over Thebes and so on, and he curses them. And the whole thing ends with Oedipus going and joining the gods. Well, that is the Oedipus at Colonus. Well, it's to these two plays, and it's quite interesting, if you will follow me a little carefully, because all new theatre is a little difficult to follow, and Mr. Abel's, I was fascinated by the word meta-theatre, that's why I chose it, is a little difficult to follow. So follow me carefully. I'll go as slowly as I can, because I feel that in this year of 1964, the fourth centenary, we should leave nothing unturned in our attempt to understand Shakespeare. The best way to understand these let me go back again after my digression. Mr. Abel feels that you must look to the two plays for the full understanding of what the movement of tragedy is. First of all, in the first play, Oedipus is destroyed. In the second, having lived through tragic destruction, he becomes divine, a daimon. And the best way to understand these two movements, first of being destroyed, doesn't mean to say he was destroyed utterly and killed. He was destroyed as a person. He was destroyed as that splendid character that he had been. He was down and out, as it were, in that sense. The best way to understand these movements, then, of being destroyed and then of becoming a daimon is by examining the idea of hubris, commonly defined as insolence. There, once again, I appeal to that course you had in Greek drama, that you may know the word hubris. Hubris is insolence. We know that, I imagine, it's bandied about a good deal. Now, and it's that insolence which brings on the anger of the gods, brings on destruction. This, of course, is always introduced into drama. But, says Mr. Abel, there is a second meaning to this ambiguous word hubris, meaning perhaps not insolence at all, but a kind of grace, in virtue of which you become a daimon. In the Oedipus King, Oedipus is destroyed, but he does not die. In Oedipus at Colonus, he has survived to become a demon. Having been forgiven the murder of his father, he now feels strong enough to curse his two sons, Polynices and Eteocles, and thus condemn them to death. This show of power is just as tragic as the weakness which brought on his original tragedy. Thus, the two plays complement each other and cover the whole domain of tragedy. And if you don't understand it, I'm not surprised. I shall attempt to explain it a little more clearly, because I assure you I've been wrestling with this ever since I bought the book. But we must, as I say, leave no stone unturned. What he is saying here, then, is that the true, full, dramatic, tragic character is the one that goes through these stages. By his first terrible downfall from the exalted position, such as Oedipus was, to the lowly position, utterly ruined and destroyed in that sense, he passes, as it were, beyond the stage of being human at all. He moves into another world and becomes a god, as it were, not a god in the sense of worship, but a sort of supernatural god. There is something of the divinity, or the other world, should we say, rather, about him. And he moves into this, and then finally, from this, he disappears into the realm of death. Now, what Mr. Abel is saying, I think I quoted him before as saying that only one tragedy did Mr. Shakespeare write. Only in Macbeth does Shakespeare succeed in getting a daimonic figure on the stage. There, of course, if we are to believe Mr. Abel, and he got two, he got two, I should say. He gets not only Macbeth, but Macduff. Thus, for Mr. Abel, Macbeth is the only true tragedy among Shakespeare's dramas. Macbeth suffers the first sort of downfall, and then at the end he is this terrible tragedy that has happened to him, the things shattering around him, everybody turning against him. He has fallen, he has committed this terrible crime, he is in the state, as it were, of a man completely fallen from the highest estate. And then he moves finally into this daimonic condition, and in the confrontation with Macduff, he has his second stage, as it were, of tragedy. Make the whole thing, therefore, totally being a total tragedy, the 2 points being completely satisfied. What then are those other ineffective tragedies into which no daimon has been introduced? And Mr. Abel deals in some detail with one of them which we all know, I hope, Hamlet. It is here that he begins to explain exactly what he means by this fascinating new thing, meta-theatre. His assumption is that it was quite impossible in the age of Elizabeth for any dramatist, including Shakespeare, to make a true tragedy of Hamlet's story. It might have been if Hamlet has killed his mother. Then there would have been something immensely tragic. But there was nothing in the situation to justify this. And furthermore, the ghost had warned him not to, but as it said, to leave her to heaven. And what if he had killed Claudius right away? Then there'd have been no play. Let us assume then, says Abel, that Shakespeare has resolved to write his Hamlet and does not know how to make it a tragedy. If the prince obeys the injunction of the ghost and kills his uncle, there is no tragedy. If the prince kills his mother without a divine order, there is no tragedy, only a horror. In the Greek play, in the play of Aeschylus, it is the god which demands this of Orestes. Then how could the play be a tragedy at all? These questions bring us closer to Shakespeare's intention and to his peculiar resolution of the drama he intended to write. Since there could be no tragedy in prompt action on Hamlet's part, Shakespeare dignifies Hamlet's inactivity, making it philosophic. So we have the wonderful soliloquy on being and not being, to which you will recall Unamuno refers, seeing in it an expression of the thirst for eternity, which he feels is part of the tragic sense. Says Abel, however, if it is better to be dead than alive, one of the alternatives discussed, how could killing Claudius avenge the murder of Hamlet's father? If there is a question as to whether one should be or not be, then there is surely no answer as to why Hamlet should kill Claudius. And the soliloquy is not only a contradiction of the assignment given Hamlet by the ghost, even more, it is a contradiction of any assignment or action. He had no reason actually to make him act. So he makes him soliloquize philosophically, projecting into the play his difficulty in making him tragic and makes him irresolute instead. However, those who see in him a victim of his irresolution have missed the dramatic movement of the play as a whole. And it is at this point that we come to something which is the very foundation of his thesis. What is that movement, he asks. Everyone knows that there is a play within the play. It's put on to catch the conscience of the king. But what only Mr. Abel has been able to see to date, and what is evident once one abandons, he says, the notion that the play is a tragedy, or that Shakespeare could not make it, is not a tragedy, or that Shakespeare could not make it so, is that there is hardly a scene in the whole work in which some character is not trying to dramatize another. When we have once grasped this, we can glimpse the new form that Shakespeare would turn to later in his career. The argument being presumably that Hamlet, dated 1601 or 2, gives him the notion for the other so-called tragedies, all post-dating Hamlet with the exception of the not too certainly dated Julius Caesar, round about 1601. In a series of quotations that we have no time to repeat, you must just accept my word for it, he shows that Gertrude is dramatizing Hamlet at one point, by which I presume we are to understand that she is suggesting he does something, or even more properly, is creating his part for him, by asking him, instructing him, for example, not to look so gloomy and to go the way he should behave and so forth. Indeed, as Abel points out, the play is full of playwrights. Fascinating. Rather than passive actors. Polonius dramatizes himself and also Ophelia. But Hamlet, says Mr. Abel, with his sensitivity to stage techniques, sees through her disguise at once. The ghost dramatizes Hamlet, he orders him around and plans his part for him, and vice versa in some ways. There are thus not only all those dramatists, But there is also one other dramatist, Death, whose dramaturgy Hamlet will in the end consent to. When he returns from England, he is ready for death, proclaiming that readiness is all. Death, then, is the terrible dramatist who can dramatize even Hamlet. And this is why he falls in with the crude, melodramatic scheming of Claudius. The latter promotes a duel, as you will remember, between Hamlet and Laertes. There could be no cruder plotting. The foil of Laertes is poisoned, and there is a poisoned wine for Hamlet to drink, if after exertion he needs refreshment. Hamlet gives not the slightest thought to the details of the duel, and acts as if he suspects nothing. He is ready now to be in the worst play possible, to act in it and pretend to believe in it. He has not accepted the role the ghost has tried to force on him, but the role from which he cannot escape anyway, the role death will inevitably make him play. The miserable melodrama of Claudius proceeds to its climax. Laertes wounds Hamlet, they exchange foils, Hamlet wounds Laertes, and the latter tells him that they will both die from the poisons on the foil. It is only when he hears that Hamlet kills Claudius. Dying, he does what he could not do when he hoped to live. It's very ingenious, I must say. Mr. Abel then goes on to discuss the quality of the various playwrights. Claudius is a writer of melodrama, not very good melodrama. The Ghost, too, is a writer of melodrama, typically Elizabethan. But as for poor old Polonius, just an amateur. No playwright could have been more mistaken in his understanding of the events, striving to control all the other characters by intrigue. And Hamlet? Well, an excellent sense of the theatre, as we see from his instructions to the players, but the ghost of his father has forbidden him to define the situation tragically. Thus he has the problem of rewriting the melodrama he has been placed in with no alternative in sight. Finally, he yields to the one dramatist whose script, like tragedy, involves necessity and places one beyond death. A death which I have called somewhat metaphorically the dramatist, in whose script all must act. Hamlet appeals to him as to an ultimate form. For a modern consciousness is not death, says Abel, here equal to the immortal gods. It would then, as it were, parallel it with ancient tragedy. This thesis of his, if you are following it, he finds answers many of the problems raised by the play. I will again not enumerate those because they may be finer points and your memories may not be too refreshed on the text of Hamlet. It also disposes of certain theories about Hamlet. For example, that it is a ritualistic play about the purification of Denmark. This is the theory of Ferguson, Francis Ferguson, who wrote The Idea of a Theatre and various other things, a well-known dramatic writer on drama, and also our friend from England who visited us frequently here, Professor Kitto. I should like to hear what Kitto says about Abel's thing. I must write to him and find out. He has a pungent way of expressing himself, as those will know who attended his lectures here. Again, while it reveals Shakespeare's inability to make a tragedy of his play, you see, hence now, if you follow Mr. Abel, Hamlet is not a tragedy. Only Macbeth is a tragedy. He made something else of it, and it doesn't mean to say that by not being a tragedy really that Shakespeare is losing caste at all. He has made something else of it, quite as extraordinary as tragedy, a point which T.S. Eliot misses, who also, and this may be news to you, some of you, who also judged Hamlet defective as tragedy, namely that for the first time in the history of drama, the problem of the protagonist is that he has a playwright's consciousness. He is the first figure, Hamlet is the first figure with an acute awareness of what it means to be staged. After Hamlet, it would be difficult for any playwright to make us respect any character lacking dramatic consciousness. The problem of author versus character was, he thinks, first envisaged in Hamlet. Hamlet, thus, is one of the first characters to be free of his author's contrivances. From now on, unless there is to be a new culture whose values we can scarcely foresee, no dramatist has the right to set any supposed self-conscious character on the stage who does not collaborate in his dramatization. In this sense, Jean-Paul Sartre was profoundly correct. No one with self-consciousness can ever do anything drastic in life or on the stage with our respect, that is, unless he has agreed to his commitment. Some 300 years later, and I'm sure you've all guessed this already, Abel points out 6 characters would visit a playwright who had not invented them, and according to his own testimony, the testimony of the playwright, and note that, according to his own testimony, asks him to be their author, according to his own, the playwright's testimony. The art, in other words, is to conceal the artifice. And herein, of course, lies the whole mystery of mimesis, in theatre at least. And Mr. Abel is giving us another variant of it. Really, that is what he is doing. If you have reflected at all about this mysterious thing, which is the creation of a work of art, what Mr. Abel is giving us is another variant of this, bolstering it with new rules, the net result of which is to move several plays of Shakespeare, hitherto labeled tragedy, into another column labeled what? Comedy? No. Comedies have to have a happy ending. Tragicomedy? Mr. Abel rejects the mixture as contradictory. What then? Some could be classified as instances of the play within a play, but this term suggests a device, not a form. What he refers to are plays with a common character, theatre pieces about life already theatricalized. By this he means that the persons appearing on the stage are not simply there because they were caught by the playwright in dramatic postures, as a camera might catch them, but because they themselves knew they were dramatic before the playwright took note of them. This is the whole question of the relationship, of course, with an author and his characters. What dramatized them originally? Myth, legend, past literature. They themselves. They represent to the playwright the effect of dramatic imagination before he has begun to exercise his own. On the other hand, unlike figures in a tragedy, they are aware of their own theatricality. Now, from a certain modern point of view, only that life which has acknowledged its inherent theatricality can be made interesting on the stage, the way we see things now. From the same modern view, events, when interesting, will have the quality of having been seen, having been thought, rather than having simply occurred. But when the playwright has the obligation to acknowledge, then the playwright has the obligation to acknowledge in the very structure of his play that it was his imagination which controlled the events from beginning to end. Now let me pause here for a moment and give you an analogy perhaps which will make this thing a little clearer. You will have to sort of take it home and reflect about it anyway. I have an advantage on you. I have been reflecting about it already. With the development of cultural values, with all sorts of developments in society and in thinking and in philosophy, relationship between the person, the people and the state and so on, all those things which are part of our life, there is a pattern in our minds of our relation to the world outside ourselves, of our relation to society, of our relation to the nature of things, and so on. It's these things that a dramatist draws upon. Sometimes they are cut and dried. I'll explain that. This will come up in a passage from Hegel in a minute. But now, this is what he's saying, and then something comes along and changes that. A new standard of values, or, and I'm going to take a very material thing now, it may be a new instrument. And I think this is an analogy which will make it clearer to you. The camera. The camera, first of all, the ordinary camera, and secondly, the moving camera. That has changed our whole values, are not our values so much, in a sense perhaps our values, but our whole relationship to the world about us, and that world about us, relationship to us. The world for us is no longer the same since we've been to the movies, so to speak. We see things, the relationships are different, you see. And this is what he means when he says, perhaps it sounded a little cryptic, that this will be this kind of thing will be the same until we get a new culture, you see. It's into the culture, as it were, that the playwright dips his hand. I hope this is helping. Plays of the kind I have in mind exist, says Abel. I did not invent them. I shall presume to designate them. I call them, pause, and perhaps at this moment, if it were possible, we should have a roll of drums. I call them meta-plays, works of meta-theatre. If there is any basis for his theory outside of a sort of Hegelian Pirandello-esque subjectivism, then it might be found to lie, I think, I'm trying to see, to do what he means, I think it might be found to lie where the professional theatre's own origin lies, somehow connected with an attitude to living that presents theatre twice daily and not as a celebration of the harvest. Or, if such a thing can retain a ritual quality, the relation, shall we say, of the Mass to Calvary, or should I say the difference between them, the differences between what was developing again in Elizabethan London, a kind of fragmentation of the pattern of living. Is there not, if we were attempting again to see an explanation for Mr. Abel's approach to this, is there not a foreshadowing hint of Descartes' cogito ergo sum? I think, therefore I am. This was a time, you know, of the beginning of the long revolution, and values were changing, philosophy was changing. There was that great leap, as it were, from the objective in a measure to the subjective. The hint, perhaps, of that there. One last explanation from Mr. Abel. Shakespeare and Calderon, he says, did not write tragedies. At least they did not write good tragedies. Shakespeare wrote one great tragedy, Macbeth. Calderon, none. What these playwrights did create was a new type of drama, one with very different assumptions from those of Greek tragedy, and with very different effects. Often they produced this characteristic and new form while intent on writing tragedy. I have asked myself, he says, and not, we may say, without reason, can I be the first one to think of designating a form which has been in existence for so long a time, about 300 years? It is a strange and not undramatic fact of life that something shiningly individual will continue to be seen darkly until it has been given a name. Why was tragedy not a characteristic form of the Elizabethan theatre? Why have most Western dramatists bent on writing tragedy been unable to do so? We are constantly asking ourselves this question. Almost the first thing that anybody says about Miller's Death of a Salesman, is it a tragedy? Do you know? We've always been worrying about this problem, at least those of us who worry about this kind of thing anyhow. We've always been sort of concerned about this. Is it a tragedy? A gentleman called Steiner produced a book the year before last called The Death of Tragedy. He feels that the tragedy has gone in that sense. Ibsen tried, and in some senses perhaps he was true, or he did it, but the trouble about Ibsen's tragedy is that if the drains were fixed or there was some antibiotic invented, there would be no necessity for the ultimate effect. It rather undermines that aspect of it. Why then was tragedy not a characteristic form of the Elizabethan theatre? Why have we, of Western dramatists bent on writing tragedy, been unable to do so? Now this is very interesting, and I think it is again, in a sense, coming back to the effect of the Cartesian development. The key word is self-consciousness. Self-consciousness which has now become sort of excessive. Everybody wants to be on television. The first self-consciousness of the dramatist, the self-consciousness of the dramatist himself, and then that of his protagonist. You see, what has happened, ostensibly, the greater part of philosophy until, shall we say, roughly just about the Elizabethan times, took things for granted, was a kind of what one might call But he was a rather ghastly expression of common sense sort of philosophy. And then, of course, we suddenly began to ask ourselves how we knew. And we were precipitated into that thing which is called epistemology, the science of knowing, of how we know, until we finally became so subjective that we created our own world, as it were. The world is my idea, do you see? So going to the other extreme. Now, somewhere along here, this thing is a self-consciousness. And this is a self-consciousness which is not just merely the kind of thing, you know, that you blush at something or other. It's not that self-consciousness. It is consciousness of self. It is an awareness now, of course, which has been magnified, if you like, by that sense of the awareness of being, that thing indeed, of course, which Unamuno is, and which, of course, is as I mentioned, there is a sense here of Kierkegaard and of Sartre and other people. First, then, the self-consciousness of the dramatist himself, and then that of his protagonist. For consider, if Antigone were self-conscious enough to suspect her own motives in burying her brother Polynices, would her story be tragic? The point of this is something that I have hinted at before, is its relationship to society. Antigone would not be self-conscious about this. This is part of life. There is no reflection about this. This is what she feels. She is not self-conscious about it. Here, then, be it said in explanation or defense as you wish, I think he is basing himself, or at least it seems to me, on a paragraph from Hegel's Aesthetics, where, speaking of the tragic hero, Hegel says that in them there is a sentiment that can be described as religious, but not mystically so, as we understand it, or as a divine conscience knowing good and evil, but not as we understand that again, but of a burning zeal for the interests and relationships of real life. And this was what Antigone was concerned with, you see, a business of real life. They are what they may and can be according to the lights that are in them. Though living and individual, they singularly reflect the power which has propelled these determined characters to identify themselves with some particular aspect of the basic realities of life, reality of life. At that level, where the simple individuating accidents disappear, whether as living representatives of powers that constitute the living substance of humanity, or whether they are already great and powerful in their own world of freedom and independence, they are, says Hegel, almost as it were on a par with sculpture, those statues of the gods that reveal the characters of Greek tragedy better than all the words written of them. I hope this helps to give a little insight, too, that sense that goes with it. But to come back to metaplay, it is the necessary form, says Abel, for dramatizing characters who, having full self-consciousness, cannot but participate in their own dramatization as the projection of an imagination which has full self-consciousness and therefore, as it were, creates self-conscious characters. This is, I think, what he is trying to say. Hence, the famous line of Jakes in Shakespeare's philosopher of metatheatre. All the world, he's already got a job. Bring him back from the dead. He's now the philosopher of metatheatre. All the world's a stage, and men and women merely players. The same notion is expressed by Calderon, who entitled one of his works, The Great Stage of the World. For both the Spanish and the English poet, says our author, there could not be but an essential illusoriness in reality. We cannot have it both ways. A gain for consciousness means a loss of the reality of its objects, certainly for the reality of its main object, the world. These are actors, as I foretold you, were all spirits, and are melted into air, into thin air, and like the baseless fabric of this vision, the cloud-capped towers, the gorgeous palaces, the solemn temples, the great globe itself, yes,
all which it inherit shall dissolve, and like this insubstantial pageant faded, leave not a wreck behind. We are such stuff as dreams are made on, and our little life is rounded with a sleep. The point he is making, he says, quoting Prospero, is that these lines with which Shakespeare terminates his theatre and the title of Calderon's Life's a Dream are not chance expressions, but fundamental concepts of the dramatic form which they initiated. As in tragedy, the misfortunes of the hero must be necessary and not accidental, so in the metaplay, life must be a dream and the world must be a stage. Well, here we leave Mr. Abel, and this centenary month of 1964 is a time when a little pedantry about unser Shakespeare is permissible. Abel is serious enough, and perhaps it's jargon that makes us smile, as when golfers talk golf and car salesmen talk cars and so on. After all, what is pedantry? Surely it's just shop talk in the wrong place. But I'll wager now that we'll all look at Lear with a new eye. But all writing about Shakespeare is not so intense, and John Wayne in the current number of Encounter has good news. Sounds like the 6 o'clock, doesn't it? There's good news tonight. Good news for the Harris student. Good news. Shakespeare is no longer impenetrable. There is no need anymore for the playgoer or reader to tolerate fantastically absurd interpretations stemming from the vanity of critics and producers, rather than from a concern to bearing Shakespeare to his natural audience, on the grounds that nobody knows what Shakespeare means, and therefore it's all right to make his work an echo chamber for one's own bright ideas. Wayne says many useful things. It's funny that I've chosen characters tonight to talk about whose names taken together are Wayne and Abel. He says many useful things like this, but he also says many wise things too, noting how Shakespeare began sophisticatedly, the successful rival of the university wits, but as he matured, material began to move in that we can only describe as deriving from the collective imagination. His plots begin to resemble folk tales, and the characters put down deeper and deeper roots into the world of dream and fairy tale. In Lear, the entire opening situation comes from the world of Jack the Giant Killer and Cinderella and her ugly sisters. And if you've ever done it, you'll know that a resume of All's Well That Ends Well will reveal that you're in exactly the same world, fairy tale and myth. For into that domain Shakespeare work moves easily. As Wayne says, once the scientific study of anthropology has destroyed those old patronizing attitudes towards primitive peoples, it became inevitable that the kind of belief involved in believing in a myth should be seen as what it is, that is to say, a life force. In our society, we're trained from babyhood to put our trust in reason. Nothing is to be believed that has not a rational underpinning. But to a savage, a belief is not something he holds in his head and refers to as one might consult a watch. It is something he lives. He believes with his body. So I suppose one might perhaps here revise Pascal to say, le corps a ses raisons que la raison ne connaît pas. The body has its reasons that the reason does not know. Again, Shakespeare's favorite poet was Ovid. Ovid of the Metamorphoses. And is not theatre metamorphosis? Have you ever sat in a dressing room, backstage, as an actor comes in after the curtain down? His eyes are glistening in the light of the makeup table. They glisten strangely in a circle of black. There's a strange flush on his cheeks, and he seems to be trembling slightly. He sits down and slowly becomes a mere man again. I don't know if you ever read anything about Louis Jouvet, the great French actor, alas now dead. He used to sit and ponder long about this in his dressing room, this strange relationship of actor and character. And Shakespeare's plays are full of this feeling. Or as Wayne puts it, his work is one vast metamorphosis. In every story he tells people put on disguise, they alter themselves, they pretend to be what they are not. This is theatre, and it is to the theatre that we must come in the end, when our man is a playwright, driving the smell of the burning midnight oil out of our nostrils with the smell of grease paint. And why we must, as a fitting climax to this series, is well illustrated by an anecdote that always delights me in the dialogues of Alfred North Whitehead. One evening after dinner, the narrator says, conversation moved to Granville Barker's production of the Trojan Women. You remember the play of Euripides, the Trojan Women, when the women of Troy are being assembled on the quayside to be taken back as slaves of the Greeks. The production of Trojan Women of Euripides in the Harvard Stadium in 1915, and there was a sudden tacit rallying of the tables talk to shield a German who was present from the discomfort of what was in every mind at the time, and that it had been a contemporaneous performance of the Belgian women, for that was why it was done. Someone said the tragedy gave a feeling of the shared guilt of all wars. Did anyone see it? Asked Whitehead. Yes, answered the narrator. And one of my old professors in the Greek department who sat next to me said, this is a complete knockdown for me. I've read the Trojan Women repeatedly and taught it. And if you had asked me this morning, I would have told you that it was full of faults and not really a very good play. And now here it is, overwhelming. You don't know a play until you've seen it acted. By the rules of pedantic dramaturgy and all the dreary classicism of the Boileaus of this world, this play that you are about to see, The Winter's Tale, is a deep offender. You are about to see that is got to put on as a climax of this series. It is neither tragedy nor comedy, nor even maybe meta-theatre. But it is full of magic. It is full of the flavor of pastoral feasts and of tragic things and the slyest of pickpockets. It is loosely built, say the authors of the Cambridge history, and great in episode. The poignant domestic tragedy, the pastoral scenes, and the rogueries of Autolycus make the play. Here, as in Pericles, the unity of time is defied to the extent of making a child grow into womanhood before our eyes. How that horrify the purists. That could never go into a play. That's again the rules. However, they say, it is important to remember that Shakespeare always respects the unity of time in spirit. Years may seem to pass, but the old grow no older. Hermione is the same fair woman at the end as she was at the beginning. There are no time schemes in Shakespeare. Forever wilt thou love and be fair is his only law of time. And she be fair is his only law of time. It was a play of his closing years, and all-embracing tolerance and kindliness inspires it. And I may add, it contains what must be, I think, everybody's favorite stage direction. Suddenly, apropos of nothing you expect, there it is on the page before you. Exit Antigonus, pursued by a bear. There is still tragic material in plenty, and there are some high-wrought tragic scenes, but the tension is soon relaxed. It is as if Shakespeare were weary of the drama and cared only to indulge his whim, weary of all the arguments about tragedy, comedy, tragicomedy, and meta-theatre. He was at the top of his profession and was no longer forced to adapt himself to the narrower conventions of the stage. He might write what he liked, and he made full use of his hard-earned liberty. And you too, after this long series, must be a little weary of the drama and ready to use Monday nights in future to indulge your whims. So now, whether it be pastoral, comical, historical, pastoral, tragical, historical, tragical, comical, pastoral, you remember your Hamlet, I see. In my role, so to speak, of prologue, I announce that on this very Friday of this week, God willing, On the winter's tale we shall ring up the curtain. Good night, gentles all.
Exit Anticulus, followed by a bear. I call your attention to the symposium. First to the Winter's Tale, which Professor Gray has already told you about, which starts this weekend, and for which there is an admission charge. And to the symposium next Monday night, which continues the theme of the faculty lecture series, but shifts the focus, the symposium concentrating on the man and his art as they find their final expression in his last plays. Participating in the symposium will be John Hausman and members of the Theater Arts, English, and Psychiatry departments of UCLA. Next, they're all on the same side. You see. They're all picking on Will. The occasion, Monday, April 27th, the time 8 p.m., not here, but in the McGowan Hall Playhouse. I want to thank you on behalf of the administration and the faculty, particularly those faculty members who gave so generously of their time to present this series, and to thank you for attending this, the faculty lecture series, but it's over, and now we can round it off with a little sleep. Goodbye.